The Cold War was a contest for spheres of influence between the United States and the Soviet Union that emerged in 1945 at the end of the Second World War for various reasons. The place to start, probably with understanding the origins of the Cold War, is a series of conferences that occurred towards the end of the Second World War. The most important one was the Yalta Conference, where the big three, the Allies, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, sat down and tried to decide how the post-war world was going to be divided and organized. And at that conference, Stalin was insistent that certain regions of Europe be more or less within his sphere of influence. And so the conference has been controversial because some people think that Roosevelt gave away too much, and other historians say no, he did the best that he could. When the war proceeded from that point forward, after Yalta, of course, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. And there are other historians who point towards the bombing of Japan as one of the sort of origins of the Cold War. And the argument here is that by dropping the bomb on Japan, the atomic bomb, the first atomic bomb in history, the United States was essentially demonstrating to the Soviet Union that we have this powerful weapon, so you better stay in line after the war. And that is very controversial as well. So, and then we get, of course, once Japan surrenders and the war is over, there's the whole question of how is Germany going to be divided. And that was discussed at Yalta, and it became the source of conflict in the early years of the Cold War. So that's pretty much the sequence of events which lead to the beginning of the Cold War. There are other factors one can look at in terms of explaining the origins of the Cold War. One of the main questions that historians like to ask is, would it make a difference if Roosevelt had lived? Because Roosevelt died, of course, before the Cold War emerged, and President Truman took over. And there's this question of personalities, and it's very clear that Stalin did not like Harry Truman and vice versa. So the cooperation that had been built through the Second World War between the United States and the Soviet Union falls apart very rapidly after 1945. And one of the explanations that historians like to look at is the personality issue. Was Truman and Stalin, did they clash because of their personalities, or was this something that was going to happen anyway? So there's this whole question of continuity versus break. Was the Cold War inevitable? Was it something that could have been avoided? The first point I would make about this question is I don't think it's useful to think about the Western perspective or the Eastern perspective, because historians, even within each of those categories, vary enormously in their interpretations of the Cold War. So, having said that, I think the question is really aimed at how does the Cold War look when we look at it from the American side, and how does it look at from the Soviet side? So from the American side, historians have long sort of been interested in how and why the U.S. officials began to concede the Soviet threat. And in retrospect, it appears very clearly that the United States exaggerated the threat. And so one of the big questions is why? When you look at the actual balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945, it's very clear that the Americans have an enormous military advantage. The Americans, for example, have a strategic air force. The Soviets do not. The Americans have the atomic bomb, at least from 1945 to 1949, and the Soviets eventually do get it. But in this short early years, they don't have it, and so that's an enormous advantage. Now, some people point to the number of troops. Americans have fewer troops on the ground. That has to do with the fact that after the Second World War, both sides demobilized their troops, but the Americans withdrew many, many more troops than the Soviets did. And that has to do with the fact that the Soviet Union was concerned about leaving its troops on the ground in Eastern Europe because it wanted to control and create a buffer zone, basically, against further hostility. When you look at the troop levels, they're not that useful because the Red Army, Stalin's army, was not well equipped. And they were also extremely exhausted after the Second World War. And the Americans had way better weapons. So the balance of power, generally speaking, was on the side of the Americans. And yet, when you read the speeches like the Truman, when you go through the documents and you look at the Truman Doctrine, for example, or the Marshall Plan, which was an economic plan to help Europe get back on its feet, These documents reveal language which is highly inflammatory. You know, the Soviets are coming, we have to protect ourselves. And it's very clear that there was a wildly exaggerated sense of the threat. And so, again, the question is why? And there are a number of reasons. There's no simple, obvious explanation, but one of them has to do, again, with personality. Some historians say that Truman liked to see things in black and white and was not accustomed, like Roosevelt was, to negotiating and finding solutions to problems. And so he would just come in and say, I hit Stalin with a hammer today, and he really caved into me. And so there is this question of personality, again, coming back into why the Americans exaggerated. There's another factor, which is what's sometimes called worst-case scenarios. Intelligence officials tend to exaggerate threats because their jobs are at stake and they don't want to be caught saying, well, the threat's not that bad, and then suddenly the threat comes and, you're caught flat-footed. So there is a kind of worst-case scenario that the CIA or the U.S. intelligence services were engaged in, and that played a factor as well. There is a sort of more functional reason that some historians point to, which is that by exaggerating the threat of the Cold War, it enabled American military contractors to justify getting larger contracts. So this is kind of what's sometimes called the military-industrial complex argument. It sort of almost verges on a conspiracy, but you don't have to make it that severe. It's basically just saying that this was a propelling force, that the Americans, after the end of the Second World War, had this enormous military machine. And you just shut it down, and where all the jobs go. And so some historians have pointed towards this exaggeration of the threat as a way to sort of keep jobs going in the military sector. So those are some of the sort of possibilities for explaining, why the Cold War broke out the way it did. On the Soviet side, again, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding of, the way Soviet historians read Stalin and his perception of the world is that the Soviets were very concerned about security, having been twice invaded through the Polish corridor in one century, First World War, and then, of course, in the Second World War with the horrible occupation of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Stalin was adamant that this would never happen again, and so that's why he began to clamp down on Eastern Europe and really began to control countries there through either military coups or by directing the Communist Party, for example, in Czechoslovakia to take power and so forth. So the Soviets were very pragmatic about their concern, but they weren't interested, as Americans believed they were, in spreading communism all over the world. There was a doctrine in the Soviet Union called socialism in one world, basically our world, and in one country. And so I think, again, back to the exaggeration, the Americans tended to misread a lot of Stalin's rhetoric about the expansion of the communist empire, if you will. I mean, having said that, it's controversial. There's no doubt that there's really a change in the Cold War from Europe. It becomes globalized, and this is where the controversy becomes, I think, even more complicated, because after the Second World War, many countries were going through a process known as decolonization. These were former colonies of the West, countries like India, regions like India. Vietnam is another example, Korea. These were countries which were suffering great poverty and underdevelopment as colonies of Western powers. And when the Second World War ended, they saw a moment in history where they had a choice. They had the ability to sort of say, we want to choose our own destiny. We no longer want to be part of a Western colony. We want to have independence. And so the formation of many new nations after the Second World War leads to this question in the Cold War about who's going to side with who. And of course, this complicates the Cold War tremendously. Suddenly, the Americans and the Soviets are looking globally now and not just regionally. And this is an important point about the Cold War, which is that the Americans, because they define their interests globally, end up having to defend their interests globally. They basically say any spot on there's no longer the business of drawing a line on the map and saying, well, our interests lie within this zone and not beyond it. Suddenly, there's no more line. It's the entire globe. And so this allowed the Americans to basically project their power on a unprecedented global scale. And it's really the beginning of what we call superpower kinds of status. And the claim is that both the Soviets and the Americans were sort of in this contest, and they were both, struggling in the world. The reality is the Americans had, again, way more influence in the Soviet Union. It isn't that the Soviet Union didn't want communism to come to power in these decolonizing countries. Certainly they did in Korea and Vietnam, and they assisted them to some degree, the communists in those countries. But they weren't exporting their revolution by force. They were doing it mostly through aid, through diplomacy, and they were not about to provoke the West either. We see this again and again in the case of Korea and Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and then later China when China becomes communist. Usually were very pragmatic about the degree to which they would promote revolution overseas. Whereas the Americans built bases globally and had, again, way more military power, more influence, better propaganda than I think the Soviet and communist bloc nations did. So this is an important dimension of the Cold War that needs to be considered. It isn't just one Cold War. There's the Cold War beginning in Europe, and then it becomes globalized. The military coup in Chile was significant primarily because it was a military coup that the United States supported against a democratically elected government, a socialist government. It isn't the first time the United States deposed a democratically elected government in Latin America. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration used the Central Intelligence Agency to overthrow the democratically elected government of Arbenz in Guatemala. The difference, though, between that period and 1973 is that by then Latin America had become a much more unstable region. There was a lot more interest in left-wing parties, left-wing ideas circulating. And of course, the Cuban Revolution, which occurred in '59, really heightened a sense of fear on the part of the United States that communism had, spread into the Western Hemisphere. And so the coup the military coup that occurred there was highly significant for that reason. It was significant for the people of Chile, obviously, because the coup led to a long dictatorship by Augusto Pinochet, who executed, imprisoned, and tortured literally tens of thousands of Chileans and led basically to a diaspora, a fleeing by Chileans across the globe. And then eventually, of course, Pinochet died, and then the government sort of returned to a more democratic phase, and today it's quite socialist in many of its, at least in terms of its orientation. But the coup was a dramatic turning point for all those reasons. In fact, if you talk about 9/11, right, to Chileans, they're not sure if you're talking about the attack on the World Trade Center or the 9/11, which was September 11th, 1973, when their government fell from power. And so, again, it's a significant moment for Chilean history. There is a lot of controversy about the coup, which is also why it's a watershed. As I mentioned, the United States had been involved in overthrowing the government of Guatemala, and so the question naturally occurred in the minds of people who have studied this event: who's responsible? The coup itself was led by a Chilean military general, and the Nixon administration did not order Pinochet to do this. Instead, what Nixon did was what's sometimes called a destabilization campaign. His administration was extremely hostile to the Allende regime because Allende was openly socialist in his beliefs and ideas and wanted to promote a certain social reform agenda program in Chile, which threatened the interests of U.S. multinational corporations in copper and in communications, ITT Corporation, for example. And so the American government was interested in seeing a change towards a more friendly government that would promote and protect U.S. enterprise. And Allende ends up nationalizing some of the American industries. And so this created a great deal of hostility on the part of the Nixon administration. So Nixon and Kissinger, as a national security advisor, devised a plan whereby they would squeeze the Chilean economy and cut off economic aid. And at the same time, they sent the CIA in to contact the military to encourage them secretly to lead a coup. And so part of the controversy here is whether or not the United States was responsible for this or not. It's not a simple matter because Allende's government had a lot of problems. It tried a lot of different reforms that were frankly not well thought out. And there was food shortages, for example. There was disruption in production. There was a lot of political instability in the streets, a lot of demonstrations and people. There were many Chileans who did not like Allende. His government was elected only by a slim margin, so he did not have a lot of political support within the parliament for his laws and his, the kind of program he wanted to spread. On the left, he had his party was a divided party. Essentially, he was a coalition of left-wing parties, and so he had to balance many, many different factors in terms of keeping his control over the revolution, and I think that also made his government unstable. And there are some historians who believe that Allende is responsible for his own downfall, in the sense that his government enacted policies that Chileans didn't want, and so they were quite happy when Pinochet deposed the government. What no one expected was that the general would stay in power. And no one expected it because if you go back far enough in Chilean history, there's a bit of a tradition, it's a little bit of a myth, but there is some truth to it, which is that Chile is not like most of the other Latin American countries, which are notorious for having military dictatorships from the beginning of their independence, through to the 20th century. Chile was a country which had a middle class, had democratic institutions, promoted literacy, had a lot of labor unions and social reform groups operating without a lot of interference by the military. So the coup came as an enormous shock to Chileans because they thought that they were somehow immune from this sort of typical banana republic dictatorship which seemed to plague so many other countries. I'll interpret this question to mean Latin America, not the United States. We could include the United States, but I think there's a real difference. I mean, for Latin America, there's kind of two sides to this story. On the one hand, the legacies of the Cold War in Latin America are pretty horrific. The Cold War led to an enormous amount of violence and conflict in which socialist and revolutionary movements were attempting to overthrow dictatorships, and the United States backed, for the most part, the prevailing status quo and backed the dictators, and so it led to a very vicious campaign of violence against the domestic populations. It's not as though violence wouldn't have occurred in Latin America anyway. It had a long history of this legacy of the colonial period. But the difference is in the 20th century, and particularly after 1945, the United States becomes involved in equipping and training the death squads, for example, in Latin America that occurred in countries like Chile and Brazil and Argentina. The United States was directly involved in training the U.S. Latin American military at the School of the Americas and also in Panama. And so the Americans become responsible to some degree for a lot of the horrific violence that occurred in Latin America. It's not that the United States was directing every single violent episode, but rather that they trained the military forces to try to make them pro-American. And any time a government came along, like Allende's government or Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic, or in the extreme case would be Castro in Cuba, there was an attempt to try to thwart this government through armed force, and this often led to conflict, which had horrible consequences for Latin Americans. To take one case, the military coup in Guatemala in 1954 led basically to a civil war which killed probably 300,000 people, including a large majority of them indigenous peoples who were caught in this conflict and died horrible deaths. Many of them were tortured, brutally disappeared. Sometimes the parents of the disappeared never find out where their children are. So this legacy of the Cold War is obviously quite tragic. On the other hand, the Cold War also led to a period, I think, of experimentation in Latin America with different types of reform governments. And once the Cold War ended in '91, there was political space opened up. Suddenly there was no longer this communist threat, or the Soviet Union was gone, and so that couldn't be used anymore to justify the kind of repression that was occurring during the Cold War itself. And so what this did in many countries is it created a political opening for the democratic forces which had been suppressed through violence to come to the fore again. And so it's quite amazing today in Latin America. You have a number of governments that have recovered from this horrific violence and have gone on to enact some of the programs that they were trying to enact during the Cold War. So, for example, in Bolivia, it's one of the most incredible stories in the history of Latin America. There's actually an indigenous person who is leading the country now. Would have been unthinkable in the Cold War or even in the century before. And so, and in Chile, you had a return to power of socialists after Pinochet died and there was a transition government. And even in Guatemala to this day, the government seems to have recovered somewhat, and there's a much more democratic process. It's by no means perfect, and there are still many, many problem spots in Latin America. Colombia is one area which is incredibly unstable due to the ongoing guerrilla warfare and drugs and all the rest. But for the most part, I would say Latin America has recovered from the Cold War in I think, unexpected ways, and has led to the sort of what's sometimes called populist regimes, which have begun to address some of the incredible poverty and underdevelopment problems that were so persistent during the Cold War.